What an honor and what a great pleasure to be with you here today among so many people with so many insights, so many talents, from so many backgrounds, and from so many disciplines. Disciplines. Think of the role that disciplines play at a university like this, or at most any university in the world. Disciplines shape our departments, they shape our courses, they shape our majors, our students, our faculty, our tenure systems, our viewpoints. Disciplines even shape our values. And yet there is so much more. There are the commonalities among, the spaces between, and the connections across. And it is that interdisciplinarity that I'd like to address today. I'm going to argue that the root of innovation itself, that holy grail of the I term, innovation, politicians, NGOs, business leaders alike seem enamored with it. The root of innovation itself lies in the combination of radically different disciplines. I make this claim, incidentally, not as a professor of business who specializes in innovation and entrepreneurship, although that is true. I make this claim as a professor of business who does not, in fact, have a degree in business. To illustrate what I mean, I'm going to use several examples from Stanford's Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics. This is an unusual center in that although everyone has a common musical interest, the center leverages disciplines ranging from neuroscience to art history to electrical engineering. And it's a center that I have studied for almost 20 years now in an ongoing quest to understand the relationship between creativity and curiosity, between innovation and interdisciplinarity. Let me give you an example of what I mean, and it's an example that begins with a single person represented here and a rather unusual composition. What a terrific soprano. What you just heard is a short excerpt from John Chowning's composition, Voices. Chowning, as you might expect, is a composer, and he's the founder of the Stanford Computer Music Program. He's also an intensely curious man, and on this particular occasion, his curiosity was directed at the ancient oracle at Delphi, Greece. Chowning wondered how the caves and chasms at Delphi may have shaped the sound of the oracle. And this composition represents his interpretation. Now, caves and chasms also pique the curiosity of a second John, John Rick. John Rick is an anthropologist, and he focuses his attention on the World Heritage Site of Chavin de Vantar in Peru. And it was at this site where John Rick discovered a remarkable cache of Strombish shell trumpets. They sound like this. That sound you just heard, 3,000 years old. Now, John Rick had a hunch that sound played a major role in the Chavin de Vantar site. But without a background in music or training in acoustics, he was limited in his ability to act upon this hunch. Fortunately, John Chowning, the musician, and John Rick, the anthropologist, met at a cocktail party and hit it off. And John Chowning suggests that they introduce a third John into the conversation, Jonathan Abel. Abel is an electrical engineer specializing in digital signal processing and specifically in measuring and modeling room acoustics. If you look at the electronics on the other side of the stage or walk into most any recording studio in the world, you will find Abel's fingerprints on the digital signal processors. This initial conversation between the musician, the electrical engineer, and the anthropologist led to a collaboration which launched an entirely new field, the field of acoustic archaeology. For it turns out that just as archaeological sites have physical features that we can see and touch, they also have acoustic features that we can hear and we can feel. By bringing together these three very different disciplines, the field of acoustic archaeology has enabled us to have some wonderful new insights about some very old sites. But the most important thing about this interaction is not the emergence of acoustic archaeology itself. It's the fact that these three individuals are embedded in a much broader community. And as they engaged in future collaborations, they took the imprint of the Chavin de Vantar experience forward. And as those people engaged in further collaborations, they took it forward and on and on. Today, for example, geophysicists are looking at how the Chavin de Vantar experience might enable them to model certain phenomena not as seismic phenomena, but rather as acoustic phenomena. I think these kinds of efforts represent innovation at its finest. And here, when I say innovation, I don't just mean widgets and gadgets and black-boxed objects. I mean new ways of thinking, new approaches to old problems, and indeed putting those approaches into action. Part of my argument is that the more diverse the ingredients we assemble, the greater the potential for novel insights. So let me distinguish what I mean by radical interdisciplinarity from three other approaches. What I have in mind is not greater specialization, represented here by the ever finer shades of red. Cognitive psychologists describe something called the cocktail party problem, which provides a nice example of this point. Listen.
The guardians of the electronic stock market NASDAQ have been burned by past ethics questions or moved.
The human brain has a remarkable ability in a cacophonous environment to zero in on one particular stream of sound and to follow it, as with the two speakers in the string quartet that you just heard, or multiple conversations in a cocktail party. We're still not quite sure how the human brain accomplishes this, and we know that it's incredibly difficult to program a computer to do the same thing. But we do know that the answer to the cocktail party problem does not lie within cognitive psychology alone. Instead, the answer lies at the intersection of cognitive psychology with neuroscience, which describes the physiology of the brain itself, and with music. For it turns out musicians have long wrestled with how to write a single instrument part to stand out against a full symphony orchestra in a concert hall filled with 2,000 people. The point is that the answer lies not in increasing specialization within disciplines, but rather in connections across disciplines. Second, what I have in mind is not collaboration amongst the usual suspects: art and art history, chemistry and biochemistry, accounting and finance. To be sure, those are important collaborations too, and they can be innovative, but they are not radical. They do not require one to cross the same barriers, and they are not as likely to encounter resistance that we see when English meets economics, when medieval poetry meets mechanical engineering, or when astrophysics meets art history. Third, what I have in mind is not hierarchical. As a business school professor, I stare at diagrams like this far too often, and I think they're an unfortunate representation of what could take place in an organization. In R&D intensive organizations, which I study in my research, we have long privileged engineering and product development over the supposedly lesser fields of sales and marketing, reserved for those people who didn't do so well in math. Today, however, when we teach entrepreneurship, we realize that the most successful companies integrate these functions, that marketing should in fact inform the product development process, not simply sell whatever they're told. And in fact, the most successful and fastest growing startups today are taking such a non-hierarchical approach to disciplines. So if I don't mean increased specialization and I don't mean collaboration amongst the usual suspects, and I don't mean hierarchy, then what do I mean? Well, I have three senses of the term radical in mind. First, I think of radical as transformative. It is not fleeting, it is not surface level, instead it is far-reaching and thorough. The three Johns, after engaging in the Chavin de Vantar experience, are forever unchanged, are forever changed in a sense. Second, I think of radical as a noun. Radicals are people who actively engage to realize thorough or complete reform. Here, the action is important. Radicals don't sit on the sidelines. They actively engage. Third, as anyone who grew up in the 1980s like I did knows, radical is rad. It's awesome, it's gnarly, it's cool stuff. And radical interdisciplinarity certainly is all of those things. So what then do we do to engender such radical interdisciplinarity? I'd like to argue that there are four essential ingredients. The first, of course, is diversity. We've heard a lot about that today, and it's incredibly important. We need diverse disciplines. We need diverse perspectives, diverse viewpoints, diverse skills and talents. We need people who have been described as T-shaped, with deep expertise in some area so as to contribute uniquely, and yet also a broad vision so that they see how these contributions might apply across a wide range of fields and problems. Also, it's important to note that we don't know whom we might need in advance. Imagine Jonathan Abel, the electrical engineer, assembling a team to design the next generation of recording studio digital signal processors. It's highly doubtful that he would have thought to include an archaeologist specializing in Peru on his team. Thus, diversity, in a sense, needs to be celebrated for diversity itself, and not with some particular end goal in mind. Second, we need an appropriately sized network. Perhaps it's obvious that if our network is too small, the possibilities for novel recombinations are limited. But we also have a problem if the network is too big. As sociologists and social psychologists describe, once communities pass a threshold size, they degenerate into what is called homophilous cliques, groups of similar other people. And again, the diversity is lost. So a bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, what we need is not too big and not too small. The Stanford Center, for example, intentionally limits its size to around 50 participants at any given time. That happens to fall right within the range that sociologists recommend. The third thing we need is churn, or turnover. When I seek to explain the university environment to business leaders, I often remind them that the university is an organization which, by its very design, turns over 25% of our most important people every single year. In fact, we celebrate this turnover, and we celebrate their departure. We throw a party, and we call it graduation. And then we celebrate new arrivals through convocation. And there is a lesson here for interdisciplinary networks. They cannot be static, or they degenerate into old ways. Composers at the Stanford Center, for example, describe how after some time they have to move on, or else their compositions begin to sound like everyone else's. Innovation is lost. In a totally different vein, the US military's DARPA organization, known for its incredibly innovative basic research, limits the tenure of its program managers to no more than 5 years, regardless of their level of success. The idea is that churn is key. And then, of course, we need the ties themselves. Now, establishing ties across diverse disciplines can be difficult. Universally approachable and appreciated languages like music can certainly help. Shared artifacts like 3,000-year-old Strombish shells that multiple people can touch and feel and interact with, even as they bring their different perspectives, can help. big, hairy, audacious problems like climate change and social justice can certainly help to bring people together in the first place. In fact, arguably the only way we will solve these problems is by bringing together diverse disciplines. And of course, cocktail parties never hurt either, as John Chowning and John Rick prove. But there is one other element that I'd like to share with you, and it was shared with me by Max Mathews. Mathews is considered the father of computer music. He was an engineer at Bell Telephone Laboratories in the 1960s, and he's the first person to formally propose that the computer could actually be a musical instrument, and not just a giant calculator. A year before he died, I asked Max Mathews how he thought to merge the then nascent field of computer science with music, of all things. And he replied, "I wasn't a very good violinist." In fact, he said, if I were better at the violin, I probably wouldn't have bothered with the computer. In other words, Mathews' fundamental contributions to an entirely new field stemmed from a respect that he, the computer scientist, had for the musician. And this may in fact be the most important ingredient of all, for it is the respect that the computer scientist has for the musician, that the musician has for the electrical engineer, that the electrical engineer has for the anthropologist, and indeed that all of us might have for one another, that truly gives rise to innovation. Thank you very much.